town mayor is sort of like a community organizer, except that you have actual responsibilities.
He worked as a community organizer. What?
You have to go through life with more than just passion for change. You need a strategy. And your plan better include voting. You see, change requires more than righteous anger. It requires a program and it requires organizing.
Imagine a world where undocumented immigrants don't have to fear their families being separated. Imagine a world if you're a single mother and you work full time, you don't live in poverty. Imagine a world where if you're a young black man or woman who walk the street, you're not racially profiled by the police and have to live with that terror. That world is only possible if we organize, and only if we organize.
They said to me, Elizabeth, if you really want to push for this consumer agency, you got to get organized. And I said, great, how? They said, I've got 2 words for you. Heather Booth.
This is Heather Booth making my first recording. It's September 19th. It was quite a day. I'm working with a group to host a rally on the Mall in Washington, D.C. called Moral Action for Climate Justice. It's a rally with Pope Francis when he speaks to the joint session of Congress. And they contacted me because they had done some outreach to some other organizations who said, you need someone to help you pull this together. You know, we have a 7:30 call of our core team around the Pope effort. So that the communications, the outreach, the central planning, the programming, the production, everyone is on the call. I chair those calls because part of being a good organizer is accountability and follow-up. Organizing is 90% follow-up. I said I thought that for an event this size, we would need $500,000 to $1 million, a minimum of 5 to 10 full-time staff, and broken into categories of program production, outreach, logistics.
And then we'll open it up to
We have the morning meeting. It's an intense meeting, and we find out several things. One, we got a cease and desist order from a business district in D.C. saying you can't put posters up. Part of organizing is dealing with the unexpected. It's easy for people to turn on each other and say, why didn't you know the law? How could you do this? We stopped doing the postering. We decided we'll just do it as flyering, handing out flyers at high traffic areas, by metros and bus stops. People can be angry at each other. It's easy to have misunderstandings. Again, that's part of organizing. Meanwhile, I'm trying to pull the parts together. Is there a press tent? Yes, there is, but it's very small. Only a small number of people can be there. Where's the credentials? We raised ideas about how to generate more press, pursuing radio interviews. Then we do a review of the speakers, and figuring out if there's a way that we can move this to be 50% people of color and 50% women. And it's always a challenge to ensure that we reach those goals. And so again, with clarity of purpose, clarity of the specific tasks, accountability on the tasks, and interconnection on the tasks. I hope I've given you some sense of what's involved in organizing, and so we approach the rest of the week.
I view my role as an organizer, and I view it as one of the highest kinds of praise you can give to someone, because it's based on the belief that if people come together and gain confidence in themselves because they're able to work with other people, that we can build a better world.
If you're in a meeting with Heather Booth and you have an idea, the next thing she will say to you is, good, so you'll take charge of getting that done. and an idea quickly becomes your responsibility.
There's a lot of us who know that if Heather's in a meeting, it's going to get somewhere. So they'll say, is this the meeting where we need to have Heather in it? People say, no, we're fine. We're not ready for that yet.
If you look at significant times in the movement, Heather is there someplace. I mean, it's like Zelig.
One man on the front lines of justice.
To be an organizer, you have to love people and hate injustice.
Strong, walk the line.
It's hard for me to say, when did I start acting on these beliefs? I felt that that's what people do.
I think our parents influenced us a great deal. We were brought up in a family where social justice was preeminent along with love, and our parents raised us with those values of trying to help others.
I was born in Brookhaven, Mississippi. I was born there because my father was in the Army in World War II. He was a physician. I really grew up in Bensonhurst, New York, in Brooklyn. And we had a lot of friends and were comfortable in the community. Moving to the North Shore of Long Island, I didn't feel I fit in. You know, to some extent, I even think feeling insecure and feeling that I was an outsider is part of who I am. We may feel that by ourselves alone, but that together we can have a new kind of power. By the time I was in high school, in part because I wasn't happy in the suburban social setting, I made my way to New York City every weekend I could. And I hung out in Greenwich Village. And it was the place where the beatniks were hanging out. And I learned how to play the guitar. The first organizational social change work I was involved in was against the death penalty. And I remember handing out my first flyers in Times Square and how frightened I was. It was a simple task. I was just handing out flyers, but I didn't even know how to do that. I dropped them. I didn't give one to a person. I get confused. And I realized that we need to give people confidence to even take simple steps like that. You need to train people. You need to support them. You need to encourage them. You don't send people out alone. And those really are elements of learning about organizing. When I graduated from high school, I went to Israel with a friend of mine, and I spent the summer on kibbutz in Lahav in the northern Negev. And I loved the remaking of a new land. We did agricultural work. We traveled around the country. In those days, it was a much more open country. When we went to the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, seeing the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto had a profound effect on me. Because this was a place where people stood up and they fought back. This feeling of better to go down standing up than living on your knees.
She taught me not only was it all right to be different, it was important to be different and to stand up for what you believe in. The kibbutz was right on the Jordan border. We would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and pick peaches. And early in the morning, Heather said, we have to find a radio. And I said, why do we have to find a radio? She said, it's the March on Washington.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
And I remember sitting on the steps of this house listening to the March on Washington with Heather.
I came back to be part of the civil rights movement. I needed to be in my country as this civil rights movement was developing. I went to the University of Chicago. Almost immediately, I felt my world was opening up. I could say the things I believed and be embraced by friends and faculty, whereas for having similar views in high school, it was much harder. Well, today is July 16th. Last night, I went to the movie about Fannie Lou Hamer, the great moral icon of the civil rights movement. Extraordinary human being, had a major impact on my life. It was being shown in a black church with many of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. In 1964, I went south to Mississippi for the Freedom Summer Project. I learned so many things from Mississippi and from Freedom Summer. It's the summer project that gained notoriety because 3 young men, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, were all picked up by the sheriff when they were investigating a church bombing, and were held, and then after nightfall, which we knew was dangerous for the volunteers, were released into the hands of the Klan. While they were looking for the bodies of the 3 young men, they found bodies of 8 other black men whose hands were bound or feet were chopped off. And I'm told those murders had never been reported. And it just shows the level of terror that people lived in Mississippi. And I was one of a number of Northern students that went down to do both voter registration and Freedom School training.
SNCC workers start preparing the young and naive volunteers for the dangers that lie ahead in Mississippi. Instructions to volunteers. If you're caught from behind, go limp. Cover your head, your groin, roll up in a knot, and hit the ground. Head as close to your knees as possible. Legs together, because a leg sticking out can be broken with one quick stump.
My parents were upset that Heather was risking her life and taking these chances, and they were concerned about her. They both felt, this is a great thing to do, we're proud of you, we want you to do this, but we're really scared.
Dear Steve, as you know, I was supposed to work as a teacher in the Delta in Mississippi, establishing a curriculum for the Freedom School. Yet the police cars, the dogs parading up and down the street, the jeers were also part of this picture. And when the lights were turned off, fear slowly came on me. Every shadow seemed to be a foe, and I thought distinctly that 2 Klansmen were there, right by the bed. In Mississippi, I was in 3 towns. The first was Ruleville with Mrs. Hamer.
2nd Congressional D Street.
She acted and spoke with such honesty, but also knew that you need to stand up and fight back and organize with others.
People hungry.
When she was at the Democratic Convention, when the Mississippi Freedom Delegation was offered 2 seats, she said, we won't take 2 seats because we're all tired.
The voter registration phase of the Mississippi Project consisted of a house-to-house canvass to try to encourage people to go to the courthouse and register to vote.
And then we went to Shaw, where I spent most of the summer. Shaw's a little town. I stayed with Andrew and Mary Lou Hawkins and their kids. And there was no paved roads, there was no street lights, there was no sewer system. And yet the white part of town, we were told, had all those accommodations. After the summer, the Hawkins family challenged the city of Shaw with a few other families that the accommodations for the white part of town couldn't be different than that in the black part of town. You had to have equal accommodations. And the Supreme Court finally made a decision that that's how the law would stand, in a decision that many say is as great as Brown versus Board of Education. Because they filed that suit, their house was firebombed twice. And in one of the firebombings, their son and 2 grandchildren were killed. Later, Mrs. Hawkins, in a conflict with a policeman in the town, he shot her to death. Now, my understanding is that the people who firebombed the house were never apprehended, and there was no trial. And the policeman was tried and exonerated.
Mississippi summer had a profound effect on me, and I think on everyone who was part of it. We saw the value of working for a goal that was much larger than ourselves. We saw how you really could create change people's lives, change the reality by taking action, because we felt there were some laws that were unjust and needed to be confronted.
Papa, don't lay that shit on me, well, it just don't compensate. No, Papa, don't lay that shit on me, well, I can't accommodate. Well, you bring me down, it makes you cool. You think I like it, you're a goddamn fool.
In 1965, my teacher told me that there was a national conference of Students for a Democratic Society that was going to have its discussion on the woman question. One of the fiery guy organizers, while I'm speaking, says to me, shut up. I felt this is no way to treat anyone, and I didn't think it was the way to treat me. So when I was done speaking, I walked around and tapped every woman in the group, about 50% of the group or more, on the shoulder, and said, let's go upstairs. And we each left. We went upstairs, left the organization, and we commit to go back to our towns, wherever we came from, and start consciousness-raising groups. I started many of these groups, and then connected with Joe Freeman.
We met at my apartment, and we called it the West Side Group. I suggested that we should have a newsletter. It became the voice of the women's liberation movement. I kept telling everyone, bring me names to put on the mailing list. Heather brought me more names than anyone else. I think she brought me more names than all the rest of everyone else put together. But that's because she's a natural organizer. You know, it's in her head to organize. I think she could organize in her sleep.
It's July 21st, and it's again been an incredibly intense day. So many organizations have their own issues. Planned Parenthood is under attack right now. There's a chipping away state by state, rule by rule. We need to stand by them.
I didn't know, as you probably do, that 1 in 3 women of reproductive age will have an abortion at some point in their life. 1 in 3. So you go 1, 2, 3. You say, oh, 1, 2.
In 1965, a friend told me his sister was pregnant and was beside herself. She wasn't ready to have a child, and she wanted an abortion.
There were some middle-class women in the city who were very desperate, and it's hard for me to say it, but basically they were getting access to abortions through the mob. I decided that I wanted to do something, and my job was to try and assure these women that everything was going to be okay, but also that they were going to be blindfolded, put in a limo, in a nice way. I basically had to say, I really don't know where you're going.
I had never thought about the issue of abortion. Now this was, again, it's 1965, and I've never had to face the issue myself. I made my way through the Medical Committee for Human Rights, the medical arm of the civil rights movement, and asked, was there anyone they knew who might perform an abortion? I was directed to a doctor, Dr. T.R.M. Howard. He was so extraordinary. He was a Black leader of the civil rights movement in Mississippi who came to Chicago when his name appeared on a Klan death list. And he started a women's clinic in Chicago on 63rd Street called Friendship Clinic. I contacted him by phone. We actually never met. So already something's remarkable that he would trust a white woman on the phone talking about abortion at a time when it was a felony. Word spread, and a few months later someone else called, and then someone else called. And I realized this is a real problem, and we need to do something about it and need more of a system. It's part of the organizer in me. And because I was living in a dormitory then, we called it Jane. People could call up and ask for Jane.
Then things radically changed because I got pregnant. This was in 1970. Wasn't making a lot of money then, and it just wasn't the right time. So I said, well, I'm going to go and use Jane. I had no fears that I would have a botched abortion or that I would not be treated with respect. And so I basically found out there was a telephone number to call. I remember when I walked into the house that it was just a very, comfortable and, homey place that I felt so at ease. I mean, it was a little, wow, this doesn't really feel frightening.
I could no longer handle the volume, which was increasing, of people coming through on the counseling service. And I also wanted to be involved in additional things. So I started to go around to meetings that I just went to normally, and at the end of the meeting would say, those people who would like to become involved in a counseling service, an abortion counseling service, they should see me after the meeting.
More hands were needed for the procedures. The women in Jane were assisting the person who was performing the procedure so much that they could learn how to do it. Because it wasn't legal, people were being very careful. Now, this was with a women's culture in women's movement support for it. In my view, we should never go back to those days. By the time Roe v. Wade came, the women of Jane themselves performed 11,000 abortions.
Ain't nobody gonna stop her now. Woman on the front lines of justice. Stand as 1 million strong, walk the line.
On May 11th, 1966, we had a demonstration, but it rained. So we went inside the administration building, which is where we were having the demonstration in front of, and we stayed for 3 days.
And we had the first sit-in against the war in Vietnam.
I had heard that she was somebody I should get to know. She was a leader of the campus Friends of SNCC, the Civil Rights Support Organization. And I was at the time the National Secretary of Students for Democratic Society, whose national headquarters was located in Chicago near the campus. And I spy Heather Tobis, and this is what you say when you go to a sit-in. If you want to meet somebody, you say, "Could I sit here?" And she said yes. And then it became a sit-in. It lasted several days and nights, and we got to know each other very well. And by the end of the week, I was ready to propose marriage, and I did. And that's the whole story there. And then, of course, I moved into her apartment very quickly thereafter, just to make sure that nothing fell through and that former boyfriends had to go out the back door.
Who's that woman with the light in her eye?
We were married, and that's 48 years ago.
It gets better and better, and we work at our marriage in the same way as our organizing.
Who's that woman with the heart for justice? Who's that woman with the light in her eyes?
I had 2 little kids. One child was born in '68 and one in '69.
She had a plan. And she knew what she wanted to do with her life, and she wanted to have a family, and she wanted to be an activist and work for what was right.
And she's so smart about it, but she's so intentional, She's so, everything she says, there's really a deliberation to it.
The first time I met Heather,
I was a young housewife, 3 children, living in the suburbs, and had been recruited by a friend to go to a great boycott picket line. All of my friends had been organizing in the 60s and while I was having babies, so this was, this was all new to me. Anyway, I go to this picket line, and here's this woman walking around the picket line, pushing a stroller with one hand, holding a baby in the other. You know, if she can do that with 2 kids, and they're younger than mine, I could do it.
It's exhausting. It's 24/7. And because you're driven by passion and for wanting to do it, it's often very difficult to balance relationships.
My husband was also an organizer, the assistant to the president at AFSCME, one of the largest public employee unions.
42 years so far with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So it's a very grounded career, just the opposite of hers.
I mean, everybody else postponed marriage and everything until we were 40 or something. And she was doing all of this with small children.
You're married, 2 activists with similar ideas, but from time to time you have to struggle with some things. You're raising children, and they must come first. It ain't easy.
There was no city-funded childcare. Women were returning to the workforce, and there was no real place that we could get loving care for our kids that we felt was safe and protected while we were at work. We organized a group called the Action Committee for Decent Childcare, ACDC.
Child care costs you, for one child, at least $40 or $50 a week.
Child care cannot do what a parent can do. I don't care what you say.
And we had about 30 women and their children who agreed to go downtown and press our demands, that there should be funding for childcare, $1 million for childcare. What we demanded was that there should be a study about, with women returning to work, what were the needs for childcare and what were the current sources of childcare. We got a meeting planned for. We get there, and the woman we were supposed to meet with, the bureaucrat, was not there. So we decide to wait. You're waiting with women and their little kids, and one of them needs a diaper change, the kids. So we do a diaper change, and we're a little embarrassed. What will we do with the diapers? And then we realize they've given us the poop. Let's give it back to them. Some of the kids start going through the files. At first we say, don't do that, this isn't our office. And then we realized, go through the files. We're looking for this study, and we find the study. At that point, we call the press. The news comes in, and as the press reporters come in, the woman who we were supposed to meet with shows up. Oh, I didn't realize you were here. I'm so glad you're here. Oh, you wanted a study? Oh, gee, we'll have to look into that. Oh, you found the study, and then agreed to hold hearings around the city. And we made childcare, with others organizing on this issue, the second leading issue in the governor's race. And within about 8 months of our starting, we won a review of childcare licensing laws, and we won $1 million in city funding for childcare at a time when $1 million was real money.
The threshold belief of organizers is that it is grassroots, ordinary people putting pressure on their members of elected officials at all levels, really, that is the key ingredient for changing policy. That without that, it really doesn't happen.
Dr. King said, the arc of history is long, but it leans toward justice. And you have to have that in mind, because you may not win on every issue, but if you have connected the dots, you have to see it in relation to the larger picture.
Democracy, as Thomas Jefferson said, is a process that has to be constantly gone back to and renewed every generation. Whenever there is progress, there will always be powerful special interests who don't really want that progress because it constrains their ability to exert their power, usually moneyed power. And so if we're not active, they're gonna be active.
There's tons of people who I'm sure, whether they know it or not, hate Heather Booth.
Glenn Beck program met a lot of interesting people the other day. One of them was a polite, soft-spoken woman who introduced herself as Heather Booth. She seems like a nice enough lady. She does. She does. But she's actually very important, isn't she? She's a true believer, Kool-Aid drinker. Okay. Saul Alinsky, he was the big guy who said, hey, community organizing and really revolutionary to take us where?
To take us in an effort to make America into a socialist country.
I went through the training center, and I learned a great deal from going through the Alinsky training. I learned ways to systematize organizing, as well as learned of some of their techniques.
When I went through the training, perhaps as a way for them to challenge the women in the training, they had said such things as women couldn't be organizers.
It was a very male crowd, and with a lot of testosterone. When Heather went to that school, there was almost all fellas in the room, and the style of the main teachers was very much a guy thing.
I thought I was an organizer and wanted to become a talented organizer. I raised my hand and said, how would I go about becoming one of his trainees? And he just looked at me and said, women don't make good organizers.
I took the challenge seriously. And so with money I won from a back pay suit, where I'd been organizing on the job, I set up a training center called Midwest Academy. And our first class were women organizers.
For more than 35 years, community organizers and other activists from around the country have come to Chicago to learn their trade. They go to a school called the Midwest Academy.
By 1973, I decided that we would create our own training center, Midwest Academy.
And I said, it'll never work. You can't teach organizing. And she said, well, why don't you come out here and see what we're doing? So I did, and discovered that it did work, much to my surprise. But we don't want to put all those health insurance company workers out of their jobs.
The mission of the Midwest Academy is to help create and build infrastructure for the progressive movement.
You need formal training, you need to serve an apprenticeship, you need experience.
We train people in several aspects of political organizing: campaign managers, field directors, research directors, communications directors, and then field organizers overall, and people who did data.
We're about helping people to win real improvements in their lives, real concrete improvements, to help people to get a sense of their own power. Intentionally don't say empower people because it sounds like we have it to give. It's how do we help them get a sense of their own power? And third, to begin to change the relations of power.
In addition to the specific training on skills and techniques, we would add how to think strategically, how to figure out what to do when you don't know what to do.
Oftentimes, in these moments of reaction to criminalization or deportation or infringement of voting rights or economic subjugation, our first instinct is to react. But Heather has a way of saying, wait a minute, what do we actually want to accomplish? What's the strategy?
The Midwest Academy has a strategy chart that is that kind of maps the development of a campaign from this question and does a self-interest analysis of the various players and how they can be engaged into action.
And I never thought I was a good writer, so I probably didn't write a lot. So a chart was just easier.
So what is a strategy? The way I look at a strategy is figuring out where you are now, where we are, looking at where we want to go. The strategy is the map or plan on how you get there.
I love the strategy chart.
The great thing about the strategy chart is that it organizes everything for you and you just need to fill it out. And it's sort of like a roadmap, right? And you just have the guidance right there. So starting with, what are your goals? So what are you trying to win? What are you fighting for?
To be a good strategist, you have to understand what it takes to win. And equally important, what is a win? You have to define what the win is. And then all the components that come into play in order to take your issue from one place in the spectrum of discussion to whatever is defined as your victory.
It's like the periodic table of elements, right? I mean, it's a chart, but it's the concept behind it that's important. And before Heather thought of the strategy chart, we didn't have a way to teach strategy.
But it's not a theoretical thing. It's like teaching the practices and principles and then making sure people then go out and do it.
We were organizing on environmental issues. This was when Chicago had amongst the highest pollution of any major city in the country. I got involved in it because I had one child who had asthma. I wasn't involved as an environmentalist. I was involved as a mother. Self-interest. We tied it to people. If you had recruited me as an environmentalist, I'd be on the phone saying, I'm washing the dishes, I'm off to another meeting, I don't have time, but I wish you luck. And they'd say, you're apathetic. You talk to me on the phone and you say, your son Dan, he can breathe better. And I say, when do I get there?
The issue that really clicked was in '78 around the energy crisis. And so we formed a group called the Citizen Labor Energy Coalition.
Energy was a very important issue at the time. Prices were going up after the Arab oil embargo. Oil and gas companies were pushing for deregulation. Utility companies were pretty much on their own with very little regulation so that they could shut people off if they were behind on their high cost of energy during the winter. Heather had begun to look at the nexus between local organizing and the importance of the labor movement, and how do you put all those together to make change.
In the 1960s, there was really a division caused mostly by cultural factors between people who opposed the Vietnam War and promoted civil rights on the one hand, and you remember the hard hats that were always opposed to those Vietnam War protesters, even though they shared absolute self-interest. That changed when Heather organized together with the Machinists Union to do battle with the big oil and big gas companies.
And eventually, we had state coalitions in over 25 states. We also started a very interesting program of door-to-door canvassing, which was the first time that canvassing was used to mobilize people around issues and raise money for organizing. You went into places where people weren't typically organized or reached, and you also happened to raise money. And at one point, Citizen Labor Energy Coalition as a group probably raised about $3 million a year from canvassing.
We know from the record that you regular voters, you voted in the past, and we wanted to make sure that you'll be voting this election day, just on Tuesday.
Suddenly, here's all these folks knocking on everybody's doors. You know, you can go right to the block that the legislator lives on, and suddenly you're being canvassed. That helps put an incredible amount of pressure on the elected official.
Well, see, the European Parliament is trying... I don't do politics. Surely they're not digging it up again. You don't do politics, remember? £3.50? Now then. For crying out loud. No.
Politics affects almost everything. So if you don't do politics, there's not much you do.
Coming out of the Alinsky model, you don't do electoral. Okay, you don't do electoral work. You organize, and it doesn't matter who's in office. We organize enough power to make them do what we want. Well, if they don't feel it's a threat, that their political life, their political position is in jeopardy, it's real hard to move them.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
After the devastating Reagan election, and it's not only bad enough that Reagan is elected, but the Republicans just wipe out many Democrats, including many very progressive Democrats in the House and Senate. So we're having our annual citizen action meeting after the election, December, I think. And Heather gets up and says, look, we've been lobbying, we've been holding demonstrations on issues. How do we think that we can exert our maximum power if a politician who's our friend runs and we're not there for him or her?
I had been less interested in elections till 1980. But what I realized, as a friend of mine, Alice Palmer, said after Reagan was elected, if you don't do politics, politics does you.
And so people who think they're going to sit on the sidelines are sadly mistaken, because something political will come and get you.
If you're someone that you look fit, you run outside, what about those days where you're warned to stay inside because you can't breathe the air? You're a young woman. Are you always going to have control over your body and make decisions about family planning for yourself and your family? I make those kinds of decisions. So I'm in your life. I'm in your home. I'm in your bedroom, unfortunately, because the Congress and decision makers are. So politics, Alice Palmer was right. Heather knows that every day of her life, that we need to be engaged because it is about us in the most intimate ways.
Chicago, Chicago, that's all the time. The machine that ran Chicago doesn't work anymore. Yet Jane Byrne and Richie Daley are still fighting over it. Harold Washington has a different plan.
But while they fight over that machine, I shall fight for Chicago by getting jobs and money from the state and federal government.
Harold Washington.
We can all win.
By the mid-'80s, the Mayor Washington movement in Chicago swept me up.
First time met Heather, Harold Washington campaign, 1983. She was organizing for the campaign, and she was at one of the highest levels of the campaign.
The political environment that gave rise to Harold Washington was extremely important. There was a murder, actually, led by the state's attorney. It woke up the sleeping giant that was the Black community with that killing two guys in their sleep. The state's attorney leads a charge and kills them in their homes. It's very reminiscent of what's going on now with all of the killings of Black men, especially by white police officers. As a result of that, there was this kind of awakening in the Black community that political power was important.
So he was our guy, he was our ally, and we're like, yeah, we gotta support Harold. We made history electing Harold Washington. It was an exciting, momentous occasion.
It was because I knew Heather that I reached out to her and a lot of other organizers to come and help me with the Harold Washington campaign. And a lot of the strategy, grassroots, unorthodox efforts took place at my kitchen table.
Everybody's got a base, but you have to grow that base in order to win and to be able to take on what seems to be impossible odds.
He was a great leader of all of Chicago and welcomed all of Chicago into City Hall, which he called the People's House, and built multiracial alliances that could just make your heart sing.
So she used her skills and training to train political neophytes like me, who did have a commitment to social justice on a broad level, right? but hadn't done door knocking, getting people to vote, organizing people for an election. She taught us that in the end, if you truly believed in your candidate and in the cause, when you spoke to people, if they liked you, they would vote for your candidate on election day.
This is the diary for July 27th. I was on a 10 a.m. call with the Voter Participation Center. They work on voting for the rising American electorate, unmarried women, African Americans, Latinos, and youth.
$2 million new voters brought to the polls. Voter turnout in Texas up 50%. Voter turnout in Florida up 60%. Black voter turnout in Missouri up 134%. And they were voting for a dead man, and the dead man won. And
In 2000, Julian Bond, who I knew from the civil rights movement, he asked me to run the advocacy arm of the NAACP, called the NAACP National Voter Fund.
When we talk about the numbers of minorities that have been locked out of this process, it really does become a civil rights issue.
Whether it's the Koch brothers and the oil companies trying to undermine environmental regulation and then undermine who can vote. Those in unaccountable power want to hold on to their unaccountable power and so need to push others back. And voting is at the center of it.
Why is it that some people are so determined to keep black people from voting on election day? You know what they do? They put armed guards and make-believe policemen at the polls. They've told voters they can't cast their votes if they've ever been arrested for anything. They told voters that if you miss the election on November 2nd, don't worry about it. You can come back on November the 3rd and cast your vote. But I'll tell you why it is, because they know when we vote, things change.
The NAACP National Voter Fund is working very hard to build this program as well. And we're conducting massive voter registration.
In 2000, the NAACP's creation of the NAACP National Voter Fund allowed it to begin for the first time developing a mechanism that would maximize African American voter turnout. Heather was the first director of the NAACP National Voter Fund, along with Julian Bond and Kwesi Nfume, Peter Cohen, and Bill Brackett. It was in 22 states, over 100 congressional districts, and she was the leader of that whole massive operation. NAACP had never seen anything like it before. So from that moment, I realized we did a great job, but we did not do a good enough job on preparing our election system for turnout of voters of that magnitude. And this played itself out most dramatically in Florida. Most people don't know this, but the biggest problem with those dangling chats was because there were so many people voting, it wasn't able to record the vote. There was 68,000, mostly African Americans, votes that were never counted because the dent on the voting card wasn't deep enough for it to count.
Initiate the voter fund. I thank the board for the legacy of what we were able to do, and I applaud the work of Greg Moore and the wonderful staff for how he will carry this on and create the elections that can't be stolen in the future when the turnout is increased as it is.
And the bell has sounded, bringing to a close an extraordinary day on Wall Street. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the closing bell.
By the fall of 2008, the markets are crashing. The Secretary of the Treasury and the head of the Fed are coming forward saying we've got to pump literally tens of billions of dollars into these banks or they're going to bring the whole economy down.
another ugly day for stocks. Bear Stearns today leading the tumble on Wall Street.
Some of the largest financial institutions in this country had figured out that they could make $1 bazillion by selling mortgages to families that were a lot like grenades with the pins pulled out. Didn't know exactly when they were going to explode, but knew that they were going to explode. And they'd be out of the picture by the time the whole thing blew up and let everybody else pick up the mess.
There were loans being peddled aggressively in communities of color above all. It was really just about stealing the wealth and home equity of people who already owned their homes.
There were a lot of consumer protection laws, just no agency that would actually get out there and enforce them.
The Republicans just hated anything that had to do with a consumer protection. Well, they didn't want to do any of the bill, but they particularly detested, I had to use that word, anything that had to do with government standing up to protect consumers.
Big banks will hate this. It will cost them money, and there is no way on God's green earth they will permit this to happen. It will not happen. So they said to me, Elizabeth, if you really want to push for this consumer agency, you got to get organized. And I said, great, how? They said, I've got 2 words for you, Heather Booth.
You are really up against some very powerful interest in Washington, Heather. What makes you think you stand a chance up against those kind of forces?
Well, first of all, it's a David and Goliath fight. We should remember that sometimes David wins. We've got trade unions, civil rights organizations, religious organizations, investors, and we broadly would like to see the values of decency, democracy, accountability, transparency, and fairness in the financial system. That system should work for us, for the American public. And people are starting to organize. We saw it clearly in Chicago. We see it in the last few weeks, maybe 150 demonstrations around the country.
Lots of different groups who said, we'll pitch in something on this. We care about what's happening to families. We care about financial reform. The big financial institutions, boy, they got organized in like a nanosecond. They were spending literally more than $1 million a day to lobby against the financial reforms and principally the consumer agency. Heather got our groups together and just kept growing. The number of groups kept showing them what was possible.
Heather is the consummate builder of coalitions. And her ability to talk to every kind of person and every kind of constituency, bringing together a unstoppable progressive coalition.
I'm Heather Booth, the Executive Director of Americans for Financial Reform. We're a coalition of over 200 national and state groups ranging from financial experts, community groups, businesses.
There is a film, it's called The Big Short, got a lot of Oscars, but what it doesn't tell, and actually it doesn't do justice to, is the significance of the reforms that were enacted. Now, Mrs. Booth likes a big challenge, and this certainly matched up to her preferences. It was a very big challenge.
And still the far-right wing and the Wall Street crowd are still coming after these reforms day after day, and it's just a deposit on what we really need to do.
Because of Americans for Financial Reform and the work that Heather was doing, we were able to get that little agency passed into law. It has already forced the biggest financial institutions in this country to return more than $5 billion directly to consumers that they cheated, and it has fired a warning shot across the bow of every big financial institution out there that issues mortgages and credit cards and payday loans and said, clean up your act or you're next. That's government that works for the people.
I see her as one of my mentors. I reached out to her when I feel fear about the organizing work that I am doing, when I have questions, when I have doubts about the strategy, and she's always there.
She has a plan and a process that she's been able to help us think about as young activists and organizers to make our vision real in the world.
I'm blessed that I can make a living, provide for myself and my family by doing work I love as an organizer, right? And I think there's a generation of us who are lucky enough to be able to do that.
It's September 26th. And today I'd say a theme is hope springs eternal.
Meanwhile, I've still got problems with my knee, my ankle, my hand, and there are signs of aging. But it is a good life. It is a good life.
It's the act and pursuit of justice, not necessarily the justice itself, that gives us purpose. And so the pushing of the rock up the hill, the struggles that we engage in, this long march towards a more just society, the joy comes from the pushing. The joy comes from the struggle. It comes from the moments where we meet together, where we sing together, where we face difficulties together.
Will you commit yourself and do often the boring, difficult, hard, it's too hot, it's too cold, I'm too tired? Will you do the work every day and build organization and support movements that will make change? On November 9th, 2016, we woke up to the end of a long and hostile presidential campaign. We did not anticipate the outcome. We need to build from love, justice, and unity and be agents of hope. The rhetoric and threatening promises that were made caused fear and anger. We will hold leaders to account. We will stand up. We will organize.
One man at the crossroads of time. One man on the front lines of justice. Stand as 1 million strong, walk the line. Stand as 1 million strong, walk the line. Ain't nobody gonna stop her now. Ain't nobody gonna stop her now. Yeah. One man on the front lines of justice. One man at the crossroads of time. One man on the front lines of justice. Stand as 1 million strong, walk the line. Stand as 1 million strong, walk the line.